6 films never played a single American theater. No distributor would touch them. No ratings board would certify them. And yet thousands of Americans saw every one of them anyway. On tapes copied so many times the picture had gone soft, passed hand to hand, at a time when owning the wrong VHS could get you a visit from local authorities. If that sounds like a story you have never heard told properly, that is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to help us keep digging through the archive nobody else wants to touch. Today, we look at the films America tried to keep out, and the underground network that brought them in anyway.
Oh, meow. No.
Cannibal Terror, 1981. Directed by Alain Deruelle. 2 criminals kidnap a wealthy child and flee into the South American jungle to wait out a ransom demand, unaware that the territory they have chosen belongs to a tribe whose relationship with outsiders has never been friendly. Alain Deruelle made this as a French-Spanish co-production at the precise commercial peak of the Italian cannibal cycle, when distributors across Europe were actively seeking any production that could replicate Cannibal Holocaust's commercial shock without the legal complications that had followed Ruggero Deodato into an actual Italian courtroom. The film never received American theatrical distribution. No major distributor submitted it for MPAA review, which meant it entered the United States exclusively through the gray market VHS import trade that flourished in specialty video stores throughout the early 1980s, often mislabeled or shelved alongside legitimate horror releases to avoid drawing attention from local authorities monitoring obscenity statutes. The jungle setting, shot using actual rainforest locations with minimal production infrastructure, gave Deruelle's practical effects team an environment where animal violence and staged human violence could be blended in ways American regulatory bodies found difficult to distinguish, and therefore difficult to certify under any existing classification. Cannibal Terror reached American audiences primarily through a single Florida-based import distributor, whose business was eventually investigated for interstate transport of obscene material, a federal case that named the film specifically in court filings as an example of the content under scrutiny. The distributor was never convicted. The case was quietly dropped after 2 years, and the import operation simply resumed under a different business name. The film itself was never the subject of any ruling. Cannibal Terror has since been released through Severin Films in a restored home video edition. Alain Deruelle made no other films of comparable notoriety. The actual production locations in South America have never been definitively identified by film historians. Cannibal Terror entered America through a gray market import chain that federal investigators eventually targeted. The next film on this list took a different path entirely, financed by a director who had already built a career making movies, designed specifically to outrun whatever regulatory body was chasing him. Devil Hunter, 1980. Directed by Jesús Franco, a kidnapped actress is taken into the jungle by her captors, who are then pursued by a mercenary hired to retrieve her, all while something considerably older and considerably less human watches from deeper in the forest. Jesús Franco made this in the Canary Islands using a production crew he had worked with across dozens of prior films, applying the same fast, low-cost shooting methods that had made him one of the most prolific directors in European exploitation cinema, regardless of what genre he happened to be working in that particular month. American distributors declined to submit Devil Hunter for theatrical certification, and it circulated instead through the same import and mail order networks that moved dozens of unrated European horror titles into the United States during this period, often sold through classified advertisements in genre fan magazines that operated in illegal gray area distributors of legitimate content avoided entirely. The jungle creature sequences, built around minimal practical effects and maximum suggestion, were specifically cited by British censors when the film was placed on that country's video nasties list in 1983, a designation American distributors used informally as a warning label, even though the United States had no equivalent official mechanism. The detail most people miss is this: the British prosecution connected to the video nasties list actually increased American interest in the film, rather than suppressing it. Import dealers specifically advertised titles using their UK banned status as a selling point, turning government censorship into the most effective marketing campaign the film ever received, entirely by accident. Devil Hunter has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Jesús Franco continued, directing well into his 80s. The Canary Islands locations used in production remain active tourist destinations today, with no public acknowledgement of their use in the film. Devil Hunter benefited from British censorship the way most banned films eventually do. The next film on this list took the cannibal cycle somewhere considerably stranger, blending the genre with science fiction in a way that confused American regulators so thoroughly they were never entirely sure which rules applied. Cannibal Apocalypse 1980, directed by Antonio Margheriti. A group of Vietnam veterans returns home carrying something they picked up overseas, a condition that transforms ordinary American suburbanites into flesh-eating predators in scenes Antonio Margheriti staged with considerably more urban, contemporary American settings than the jungle-bound cannibal films that had preceded it. The film essentially relocated the entire cannibal subgenre into American cities and American veterans, which made it simultaneously more commercially approachable and more uncomfortable for distributors actually operating in those same American cities. John Saxon, a recognizable American actor with a substantial legitimate Hollywood resume, took the lead role specifically because Margheriti believed his presence might help the film secure wider distribution than the genre typically achieved. It did not work. American distributors still declined theatrical certification, and the film entered the country primarily through the same VHS import channels that handled the rest of the cycle, despite Saxon's name recognition theoretically giving it crossover appeal that titles featuring no familiar American performers simply could not access. The detail worth knowing involves Saxon himself. He reportedly accepted the role specifically because he found the screenplay's connection between Vietnam trauma and cannibalistic violence to be a genuinely serious metaphor worth exploring, regardless of the exploitation packaging surrounding it. Margheriti has confirmed in later interviews that this was the actual creative intent behind relocating the genre to American soil, even though virtually no American distributor or critic engaged with that reading at the time of release. Cannibal Apocalypse has been released through Grindhouse Releasing in a restored edition featuring new interview material with surviving cast members. Antonio Margheriti continued directing across multiple genres throughout the 1980s. John Saxon discussed the film periodically in convention interviews, until his death in 2020, consistently defending its underlying premise. Emanuelle and the Last Cannibals, 1977, directed by Joe D'Amato. A journalist investigating conditions inside a psychiatric hospital discovers a patient whose body bears markings connecting her to an isolated cannibal tribe in the Amazon, launching an expedition that blends the era's softcore Emanuelle franchise with the increasingly graphic cannibal subgenre that Italian producers were racing to commercially exploit. Joe D'Amato, working under one of the dozens of pseudonyms he used across his prolific career, built the production specifically to combine two commercially proven exploitation formulas into a single release, betting that audiences for either genre would tolerate the other half of the combination. The film never reached American theaters through any legitimate distributor, entering the country instead through adult bookstore networks and mail-order catalogs that specifically catered to collectors seeking unrated international horror, a distribution channel almost entirely separate from the mainstream video rental stores most Americans associate with VHS-era horror discovery. This created two nearly invisible American audiences for the same film, neither one fully aware the other existed, until convention culture and internet forums eventually connected the two collector communities decades later. The detail worth flagging involves the hospital sequences at the start of the film. D'Amato reportedly shot portions of these scenes using actual unscripted patient interactions at a cooperating facility, blurring documentary footage with staged horror content in a way several critics have since argued was ethically questionable, regardless of the era's significantly looser production standards. Emanuelle and the Last Cannibals has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Joe D'Amato directed an estimated 200 films across his career under multiple names. The psychiatric facility used in early production sequences has never been identified. Emanuelle and the Last Cannibals moved through adult bookstore networks most horror collectors never knew existed. The next film took the genre somewhere considerably more anthropologically ambitious and somewhat more expensive, which created an entirely different kind of distribution problem. Mountain of the Cannibal God, 1978, directed by Sergio Martino. A woman searching for her missing husband in New Guinea hires a guide to lead an expedition into territory controlled by a tribe whose religious practices involve a level of ritual violence, the production staged with considerably higher technical polish than most entries in the cannibal cycle, owing to Sergio Martino's background directing higher-budget Italian thrillers before moving into this genre specifically to capitalize on its commercial momentum. Ursula Andress, an actress with genuine international recognition from her Bond franchise work, anchored the production in a way that gave it crossover commercial ambitions the rest of the cycle rarely attempted. American distributors still declined certification, despite Andress's name recognition, and the film entered the United States through the same fragmented import network, handling the rest of the genre. Though its higher production values made it a more frequently requested title among specialty video store owners willing to stock unrated international horror under the counter for established customers. The detail here involves animal violence sequences that drew formal complaints from wildlife protection organizations in multiple countries. Complaints that never resulted in legal action against the production, but did contribute to several territories restricting the film's distribution, specifically on those grounds rather than the human violence content that typically drove Cannibal Cycle censorship decisions. Mountain of the Cannibal God has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Sergio Martino moved between multiple genres throughout his career. Ursula Andress rarely discussed the production in subsequent interviews. Mountain of the Cannibal God drew complaints over its animal violence specifically, a censorship angle most of this list never encountered. The final film tonight involves something considerably more serious. Footage convincing enough that authorities reportedly treated it as potential evidence rather than entertainment.
Remember me, Doctor? Well. Don't want to.
Just what are you doing here? Spying?
You'll know soon.
Yes, darling.
Faceless, 1988. Directed by Jesús Franco. A plastic surgeon disfigures patients in his private clinic while attempting to perfect a face transplant procedure for his sister, whose own face was damaged in an accident, leading to a series of kidnappings and medical experimentation sequences, staged with considerably more clinical procedural detail than the jungle-set cannibal films earlier on this list. Jesús Franco built the production around practical medical effects designed specifically to read as plausible rather than theatrical, a deliberate departure from the more obviously staged gore of his earlier genre work. The film entered American distribution discussions, but ultimately received only limited theatrical exposure through specialty genre festivals rather than wide release, with home video distribution handling the bulk of its American audience exposure through specifically labeled unrated horror lines that several major chains declined to stock given the surgical content. The detail connected to this film involves its reception in continental Europe rather than America specifically. Reports from the period indicate French authorities briefly examined whether certain medical procedure sequences had been filmed using techniques requiring genuine medical consultation that exceeded standard practical effects work, an inquiry that concluded without any findings of wrongdoing, but that contributed significantly to the film's reputation as uncomfortably convincing. Faceless has been released through Severin Films in a restored edition. Jesús Franco continued working until shortly before his death in 2013. The clinic interiors were constructed on a studio set rather than any actual medical facility. None of these 6 films ever needed a marketing department. Every distributor who refused them, every censor who flagged them, every customs agent who pulled a tape off a shelf did the advertising for free. The harder America made these films to find, the more valuable finding them became to the people determined to see them anyway. That raises a real question worth sitting with. If a government or a studio decides certain content is too dangerous for public consumption, and the only result of that decision is driving the same content into an unregulated black market, with no quality control and no accountability whatsoever, who actually benefits from the ban? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know where you land on this. Subscribe if you want the rest of the archive. We are nowhere near finished.